Elijah Whittaker sat in the cool leather of his business class seat, his hands resting on the smooth wood grain armrests as if testing their reality. At 17, he carried himself with a quiet poise that belied his years. A hard-won composure cultivated through countless hours of music practice and whispered affirmations from his mother. Grace. She had saved, stretched, and sacrificed to buy this seat this moment. It wasn't just a ticket to a national music competition, it was a declaration. A space in the world carved out through grit and love. The murmurs of the cabin swirled around him like an alien symphony, the rustle of newspapers, the clink of glasses, the low hum of conversation. Elijah placed his sheet music on the tray table, each note a refuge. Outside the small oval window, the tarmac gleamed under the morning sun, but his focus turned inward to the quiet storm of pride and nerves that churned in his chest. His was not the anxious excitement of a teenager flying alone for the first time, but the tempered resolve of someone who had fought to belong in every room he entered. The flight attendant approached. Elijah noticed her before she spoke. Linda Holcomb moved with the calculated precision of someone accustomed to control, her heels clicking against the aisle like a metronome. Her eyes scanned the cabin, briefly landing on each passenger, but they lingered when they reached him. Her expression tightened, almost imperceptibly, but Elijah caught at a flicker of doubt, a question forming before any words passed her lips. "Excuse me, young man," she said, her tone firm yet wrapped in the veneer of politeness. "May I see your boarding pass?" Elijah glanced up, surprised but not startled. "Of course," he replied, his voice calm as he retrieved the slip of paper from his pocket. He handed it over, meeting her gaze with a quiet steadiness. Linda studied the ticket with a precision that bordered on suspicion. Her lips pursed as she glanced between the ticket and the boy before her. Elijah's posture did not waver, but inside, he felt the familiar weight pressing on him. He had seen this before, the unspoken assumption that he did not belong. "It's valid," Linda murmured, almost to herself. "Business class, huh?" Elijah smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "My mother bought the ticket for me," he said. "She wanted me to be comfortable for the flight." Linda's eyes flicked back to his face, searching for something: confirmation, a crack in his story, a reason to justify the doubt that had bloomed in her mind. She said, the sound hanging in the air like an unanswered question. She handed the ticket back, her fingers brushing his as though contact might provide some missing evidence. "Thank you," she said, her tone clipped, and turned on her heel. But Elijah noticed her hesitation before she walked away. Her body stiffened as if bracing against an unseen force, her shoulders heavy with the weight of her own assumptions. Elijah exhaled slowly, his father's voice echoing in his mind. "Hold your ground, son. People will test you, but don't let them define you." He returned to his music, though the notes seemed more distant now. The world outside the cabin had shifted, and with it, his focus. The challenge had begun, though neither Elijah nor Linda fully understood it yet. Here, Baldwin's narrative sharpens its lens. The scene is not merely about a young man and a skeptical flight attendant. It is about the unspoken rules of belonging, the subtle hierarchies enforced with every glance, every hesitation, every clipped word. Elijah's presence in business class was more than a seat assignment, it was a quiet disruption of a narrative that had been written long before he boarded the plane. As the engines roared to life and the plane lifted into the sky, Elijah felt the cabin press him into his seat. He wondered if the flight would be smooth or if the turbulence already simmering beneath the surface would break free. For now, he sat still, his sheet music before him, the notes rising like a shield against the quiet hostility of the world he sought to navigate. The hum of the engines was steady, but inside Elijah, the rhythm of the flight felt uneven. He had returned to his music, but his focus wavered. Notes that once held the clarity of a summer breeze now blurred like a foggy morning. He stole a glance at Linda as she moved briskly down the aisle, her sharp gaze sweeping the cabin like a sentinel guarding an unspoken boundary. Each step seemed deliberate, as though she carried the weight of something unacknowledged. A man seated across the aisle, middle-aged, white, in a tailored suit, offered Elijah a polite nod, but the glance that followed lingered just a moment too long. Elijah felt its unspoken weight. "What are you doing here?" He didn't acknowledge the look, choosing instead to adjust his seat and shuffle his music. But the moment lodged in his mind like a splinter, subtle yet persistent. The flight attendant returned. Linda's face was a mask of professionalism, but her eyes betrayed her thoughts. She paused at Elijah's row again, her presence a sudden shadow over his seat. "There seems to be an issue with your ticket," she said, her tone no longer polite but clipped. Authoritative. Elijah frowned, his confusion genuine. "An issue?" he asked, glancing down at the boarding pass that had already been inspected and returned. Linda didn't elaborate. "Please follow me," she said, stepping back to give him room to stand. The whispers began before Elijah could gather his belongings. A ripple of murmurs spread through the cabin, faint yet unmistakable, as if the passengers collectively decided to bear witness to this unexpected spectacle. Elijah felt the heat of their gazes, some curious, others judgmental. He rose slowly, lifting his guitar case with care, and followed Linda toward the galley at the front of the plane. The transition from the spacious business-class cabin to the cramped galley was stark. And so was Linda's shift in demeanor. Her polite veneer dissolved as she crossed her arms and faced him directly. Her posture rigid, her voice carrying the cold certainty of someone who believed they were in the right. "This seat doesn't seem appropriate for you," she said, the words carefully chosen but cutting all the same. "You should be in economy." Elijah felt the sting immediately. It wasn't about the seat, and they both knew it. It was about the assumptions swirling behind her sharp gaze. Assumptions that had followed him long before he stepped onto this plane. "My ticket is valid," he said, his voice steady despite the knot tightening in his chest. "There's no reason I should be moved." Linda's expression hardened. "I believe there was an error when your seat was assigned. Business class isn't where you belong." The words hit like a slap. But Elijah didn't flinch. His father's lessons echoed in his mind. "People will try to move you from where you stand, son, but your place is yours. Claim it. If there's an error, I'll need proof," Elijah said, his tone calm but firm. "Otherwise, I'd like to stay in my seat." For a moment, it seemed Linda might relent. Her mouth opened as if to speak, but instead, her jaw tightened. "I'll involve security if I have to," she said, the threat unmistakable. Elijah's stomach twisted, but he refused to break. He nodded slowly. "Fine," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, yet laced with quiet defiance. As they walked back through the cabin, the stares returned, now more pointed, more invasive. Elijah could feel the weight of judgment in every pair of eyes that followed him down the aisle. Whispers turned to murmurs, and though the words were indistinct, their meaning was clear enough. What did he do? When Elijah reached the economy section, the contrast was jarring. The narrow seats and crowded rows felt like a physical manifestation of the invisible boundaries Linda had imposed. He slid into the middle seat she had assigned him, his guitar case now crammed awkwardly between his knees. The space was confining, but what truly pressed against him was the humiliation that clung to his skin like a second layer. Linda returned to her duties, her heels clicking with a finality that seemed to signal victory. But Elijah didn't see it that way. He pulled out his phone and sent a message to his mother. "They moved me to economy without reason. Can you check it out?" Her response came swiftly. "Don't worry, Elijah. I'll handle this." Elijah leaned back in his seat, staring out the small window. The horizon stretched endlessly, a reminder of the vastness of the world and the limits imposed within it. He thought of his mother's words and his father's lessons. But most of all, he thought of the quiet war being waged around him, the war of assumptions, of unspoken hierarchies, of who gets to belong and who doesn't. This wasn't just a flight anymore. It was a microcosm of something far larger, something deeply rooted and unyielding. Elijah closed his eyes, the hum of the plane filling his ears, and resolved to hold his ground not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. Elijah shifted in his cramped economy seat, his knees pressed against the seat in front of him, his guitar case awkwardly wedged at his feet. Around him, the murmur of voices filled the air, a low hum of normalcy that felt worlds apart from his rising frustration. He kept his gaze fixed on the small window, trying to drown out the whispers that echoed louder in his mind than in the cabin. The reality of the moment began to settle over him like a heavy fog. It wasn't just the seat, it was what it represented. What had I done to deserve this? He wondered, the question lingering in his mind like a faint, persistent ache. He had followed the rules, worked hard, and carried himself with dignity. Yet, here he was relocated, diminished, judged. The flight attendant passed by, offering drinks to the passengers in the economy cabin. When she reached Elijah, her tone lacked the warmth she had shown others. "Would you like something to drink?" she asked, her eyes not meeting his. "Water, please," Elijah replied, keeping his voice neutral. She handed him a plastic cup without a word and moved on. The absence of connection is palpable as a slammed door. Elijah took a sip and set the cup on his tray, feeling a wave of heat rise to his face. It was a small moment. But small moments like these could accumulate into something far heavier. A quiet indictment of how the world often worked for people like him. Blank. Underscore. Blank. In the business class cabin, Linda Holcomb adjusted her uniform and tried to shake the unease that had settled in her chest. Moving Elijah had been a decision she justified to herself as doing her job. But Mark Taylor's earlier question still rang in her ears. "Did you verify the ticket?" She had avoided the question then, just as she avoided thinking about it now. Linda's unease deepened when a passenger, the well-dressed man from Elijah's row, flagged her down. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low but firm. "I couldn't help but notice the young man who was sitting here earlier." "Why did you move him?" Linda stiffened, her professional smile barely concealing her discomfort. "There was an issue with his ticket," she said quickly, hoping the explanation would suffice. The man raised an eyebrow. "An issue? From what I saw, he had a valid ticket. You didn't move him because of appearances, did you?" Linda's cheeks flushed, but her composure remained intact. "Of course not," she said, her tone defensive. "I assure you, it was a procedural matter." The man didn't press further. But the pointed nature of his question lingered in the air. A silent accusation. Linda turned away, her heart beating faster as she walked briskly toward the galley. For the first time, she began to wonder if her actions had been more about her own assumptions than any procedural necessity. Blank. Underscore. Blank. Back in economy, Elijah's phone buzzed with a message from his mother. "I've spoken with customer service. They're escalating the issue. Sit tight, Elijah. This isn't over." Her words were a lifeline, but they couldn't undo the humiliation he felt. Elijah glanced around the cabin, catching the eyes of a young boy seated a few rows ahead. The boy, no older than 8, gave him a wide, innocent grin before turning back to his book. The simplicity of the gesture struck Elijah a reminder that prejudice was not born but learned, absorbed over time like a slow, insidious toxin. As the flight progressed, Elijah noticed the widening gulf between how he was treated and how others were treated. The flight attendants barely made eye contact with him, their smiles reserved for other passengers. A couple seated nearby shifted uncomfortably when he reached for his bag, as if the act alone was suspicious. Each moment seemed small, almost imperceptible, but together they painted a picture of the quiet, relentless challenges he faced. Blank. Underscore. Blank. In the cockpit, Linda's day took another turn. The intercom buzzed, and the captain's voice called her to the cockpit. She hesitated before answering, her stomach knotting as she walked the short distance. Inside, Captain Hayes handed her a phone. "Corporate wants to speak with you," he said, his voice curt. Linda's hand trembled as she lifted the receiver. The voice on the other end was calm but firm. "Ms. Holcomb, we've received a complaint about your handling of a passenger in business class. We'll need a detailed explanation when the flight lands." The words hit Linda like a blow. She mumbled her acknowledgement and handed the phone back to the captain. Her mind racing. The confidence she had carried earlier now felt hollow, her justifications unraveling under scrutiny. Blank. Underscore. Blank. For Elijah, the tension reached a breaking point when a passenger leaned over to him during a quiet moment. She was an older black woman, her face lined with years of wisdom and resilience. "Young man," she said softly, "I saw what they did to you. Don't let it break you." Her words were like a balm, soothing the raw edges of his frustration. Elijah nodded, offering her a small smile. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady despite the storm inside. The woman nodded, her gaze unwavering. "They'll try to make you small, but you don't have to let them." As the plane began its descent, Elijah felt a renewed sense of resolve. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about his mother, the passengers who silently supported him, and the countless others who faced similar battles every day. He straightened in his seat, the quiet storm within him coalescing into something stronger, determination. In the days to come, this flight would become more than just a journey from one place to another. It would be a moment that revealed the fractures in the world around him, a world that still struggled to see him and others like him as whole. But for now, as the plane touched down, Elijah braced himself for what came next, ready to face the turbulence ahead. The plane's landing gear hummed beneath Elijah's feet as they prepared for descent. The quiet hum of the aircraft's engines provided a sharp contrast to the cacophony of emotions swirling within him. His mother's texts, firm, supportive, brimming with indignation, played on a loop in his mind. "I'll handle this," she had written, her words a promise as much as a reassurance. Yet, Elijah couldn't shake the knot of frustration tightening in his chest. Handling it wasn't enough. Not anymore. As the seatbelt sign blinked on, Elijah stole a glance around the economy cabin. The quiet interactions of passengers, parents soothing restless children, business travelers organizing their belongings were a world apart from the simmering indignation he carried. Every glance from the flight attendants, every hurried step past his row, seemed to underscore his invisibility. And yet, paradoxically, the memory of the business class passengers' judgmental stares made him feel hyper-visible, as though his very existence was a challenge to their assumptions. Blank. Linda Holcomb stood near the galley, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. The phone call from corporate played over and over in her mind, the calm authority of the voice on the other end undermining the self-assurance she had carried earlier. She had thought herself immune to error, protected by years of experience and a meticulous adherence to her rules. But now, cracks had begun to appear in that armor, and through them seeped an uncomfortable truth. Perhaps the issue wasn't Elijah's ticket, but her assumptions. Mark Taylor, the lead flight attendant, approached her, his expression unreadable. "Linda," he said, his tone measured but firm. "We need to talk." Linda bristled. "I've already explained." "No," Mark interrupted, his voice calm but insistent. "You haven't. You made a decision that didn't follow protocol. And now we're all answering for it." Linda's posture stiffened, but she didn't respond. Mark's words cut through the protective wall she had built around herself, exposing the quiet prejudice she had long refused to name. In the economy cabin, the older black woman who had offered Elijah encouragement leaned closer. "Young man," she said softly, her voice like a melody etched with the weight of experience, "this isn't just your fight. It never has been." Elijah turned to her, his expression a mixture of gratitude and curiosity. She continued, her gaze steady. "I've seen this kind of thing my whole life. You carry it differently, though quieter, maybe, but don't let it fester. Speak up, even when they don't want to hear you." Elijah nodded, her words settling over him like a warm blanket on a cold night. "Thank you," he said again, his voice steadier this time. The plane touched down with a jarring thud, the cabin filling with the collective release of tension as passengers prepared to disembark. For Linda, the descent was not a relief but a harbinger of the reckoning that awaited her. As she moved through the cabin, checking on passengers, her usual confidence was replaced by a strained professionalism. Elijah watched her approach, his heart pounding as their eyes met. For a moment, the tension between them was palpable, an unspoken confrontation that neither seemed willing to address. "Thank you for flying with us," Linda said, her voice strained, her attempt at a smile faltering. Elijah returned her gaze, his expression calm but resolute. "You'll be hearing from my mother," he said, his words deliberate, each syllable carrying the weight of his quiet defiance. Linda's face paled, and she turned quickly, retreating toward the front of the plane. Elijah felt a flicker of satisfaction, not from her discomfort but from the knowledge that his voice, however small, had been heard. In the terminal, Elijah spotted his mother, Grace Whitaker, standing near the curb. She was dressed simply, but her presence commanded attention. Her arms opened wide as Elijah approached, pulling him into a hug that carried years of love, sacrifice, and resilience. "I'm fine, Mom," Elijah said, though his voice betrayed the weight of the ordeal. Grace pulled back, her eyes searching his face. "No, you're not," she said, her tone soft but firm. "And that's okay, but we're going to make this right." As they walked toward the car, Elijah recounted the details of what had happened. Grace listened intently, her expression a mixture of anger and resolve. When Elijah finished, she placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "They moved you because they didn't think you belonged," she said, her voice steady. "But you do, Elijah. You belong anywhere you choose to be." Elijah nodded, her words grounding him in a way he hadn't realized he needed. Blank. Underscore. Blank. Back on the plane, Linda was met at the gate by two airline representatives. Their expressions were serious, their presence a silent confirmation that the complaint had reached the highest levels. "Ms. Holcomb," one of them said, "we need to speak with you about your conduct on this flight." Linda nodded, her professional demeanor faltering as she followed them down the jet bridge. The echoes of her heels on the metal floor felt heavier with each step. A reminder of the consequences she now faced. Blank. Underscore. Blank. For Elijah, the ordeal was far from over. As he and Grace drove away from the airport, he stared out the window, his thoughts racing. This moment, this incident, was more than a personal affront. It was a reflection of a larger, insidious truth, a society still grappling with its own contradictions, its promises of equality undermined by the quiet, persistent weight of prejudice. Grace glanced at her son, sensing the storm within him. "This isn't just about you, Elijah," she said, echoing the words of the older woman on the plane. "It's about everyone who's ever been told they don't belong. And together, we'll make sure they hear us." Elijah nodded, her words settling into his heart like seeds, ready to grow. The fight wasn't over, but as the car merged onto the highway, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was only the beginning. The drive home from the airport was filled with the kind of silence that wasn't empty but full of unspoken words. Grace Whitaker's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles pale against her dark skin. Elijah sat beside her, his gaze fixed on the passing scenery, the rhythm of the highway a dull backdrop to the storm brewing inside him. "Elijah," Grace began, her voice steady but carrying the weight of her concern. "Tell me everything again." He sighed, the exhaustion in his body mirrored by the heaviness in his heart. "She looked at me like I didn't belong," he said quietly, "like I couldn't belong, and then she moved me. Just like that. No explanation that made sense. No apology." Grace's jaw tightened. "She saw a young black man and decided you weren't supposed to be there." Elijah nodded, but his mind was already spinning toward the implications. It wasn't just about Linda or that flight. It was about the countless ways the world quietly, insidiously told him and others like him that they were out of place. Blank. Underscore. Blank. Back at the airport, Linda Holcomb sat in a small conference room, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Across the table sat two airline representatives, their expressions firm but not unkind. "Ms. Holcomb," one of them began, "we've received a serious complaint about your handling of a passenger." Linda's professional facade remained intact, but inside, she felt her defenses crumbling. "I was following procedure," she said, her voice measured. "There was an issue with the ticket." The representatives exchanged a glance. "From what we've reviewed," the man continued, "there was no issue with the ticket. It appears your decision to move the passenger was based on an assumption." Linda stiffened. "I thought." "We're not asking what you thought," the woman interrupted, her tone sharper now. "We're asking why you acted the way you did." For the first time, Linda couldn't summon an answer that sounded reasonable, even to her own ears. The quiet questions she had avoided all day now roared in her mind. Why did I assume he didn't belong? Why did I feel the need to act at all? Blank. Underscore. Blank. At home, Grace and Elijah sat across from each other at the kitchen table. The warmth of the room, with its familiar smells of home-cooked meals and worn wooden surfaces, felt like a fragile buffer against the cold reality they faced. Grace's laptop was open, her fingers flying over the keys as she drafted a formal complaint. "This isn't just about you, Elijah," she said, echoing the sentiment they had both heard on the plane. "This is about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Elijah watched her, the weight of her determination stirring something in him. "Do you think they'll care?" he asked, his voice tinged with skepticism. "Or will they just sweep it under the rug?" Grace stopped typing and looked at him, her eyes filled with the same fire he had seen when she advocated for her students or stood up to injustices in their community. "We'll make them care," she said firmly, "because if we don't, who will?" Blank. Underscore. Blank. The following day, Elijah and Grace received a call from the airline. The representative's voice was calm, professional, and apologetic. They wanted to arrange a meeting. We take these matters very seriously, the woman said, and we'd like to discuss how we can address this situation. Elijah felt a flicker of vindication, but it was quickly tempered by the enormity of what lay ahead. This wasn't just about sitting at a table with airline executives. It was about confronting a system that had quietly, persistently marginalized people like him. Blank. Blank. In her apartment, Linda sat alone, her uniform neatly folded on the arm of the chair. She stared at the cup of tea in her hands, its steam curling upward like a question mark. The meeting with the airline representatives had left her shaken. They hadn't reprimanded her yet, but their words had made it clear that her actions were under scrutiny. For the first time, Linda began to question the assumptions she carried. She thought of Elijah, his calm demeanor, his quiet defiance. She thought of her own reaction, the certainty that had propelled her decision, and the unease that had followed. Was it really about the ticket? She asked herself, though she already knew the answer. Blank. The day of the meeting arrived. Elijah, dressed in a crisp shirt and slacks, sat beside Grace in a conference room filled with airline executives. Their faces were a mixture of concern and formality, their postures stiff but attentive. Elijah, one of them began, "We've reviewed the incident and would like to apologize for what happened. It's clear there were mistakes made, and we want to ensure this doesn't happen again." Elijah nodded, his heart pounding. "I appreciate the apology," he said, his voice steady but firm. "But this isn't just about what happened to me. It's about the assumptions people make, assumptions that can lead to moments like this." He paused, letting his words sink in. "You have the power to change that. To train your staff to see passengers as people, not as stereotypes. To ensure that no one else has to feel what I felt." The executives exchanged glances, and for the first time, Elijah saw something shift in their expressions. It wasn't just concern now, it was recognition. Blank. In the days that followed, the airline announced plans to implement new training programs focused on unconscious bias and empathy. Elijah's story began to circulate, not as a tale of victimhood, but as a call to action. For Linda, the changes felt like a mirror held up to her own biases. She attended the training sessions, not because she had to, but because she needed to. Slowly, she began to understand that the assumptions she had carried were not harmless, they were part of a larger, insidious pattern. For Elijah, the journey wasn't over. The memory of Linda's actions, the whispers on the plane, and the silent stares still lingered. But he carried something else now. Too, a sense of purpose. A belief that even small voices could create ripples of change. As he sat at his desk, writing a letter to the passengers who had supported him on that flight, he felt a quiet determination settle within him. This wasn't just his story, it was theirs, too. And together, they would continue to challenge the silent forces that sought to define them. The echoes of assumption would not go unanswered. Elijah's meeting with the airline executives had ended, but the echoes of that small, sterile room lingered in his mind. Sitting in the passenger seat as his mother drove them home, he replayed the conversation, the careful words of apology and the promises of change. Yet, for all their reassurances, something felt incomplete, a silence that remained unbroken, a question unanswered. "They heard you," Grace said, her eyes on the road but her tone steady. "And that's the first step." Elijah nodded, but his doubt lingered. "Do you think they'll really change? Or was this just about saving face?" Grace glanced at him, her expression softening. "Change doesn't come easy, Elijah, especially not for something as ingrained as this. But what matters is that you spoke up. You didn't let them ignore you." He wanted to believe her, but the quiet weight of history pressed against him. For every apology, there had been countless silences. For every promise of progress, there were invisible walls that still stood firm. Meanwhile, Linda Holcomb sat in her own silence, the weight of the last few days settling heavily on her shoulders. The training session she had attended that morning, mandatory now for all employees, had forced her to confront truths she had long avoided. The facilitator had spoken plainly. Bias isn't always loud. It isn't always violent. Sometimes, it's a whisper, a hesitation, a doubt, a decision made without a second thought. Linda had sat stiffly in her chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She hadn't spoken during the discussion, but the words had cut through her like a blade. She thought of Elijah, his calm resolve, the way he had looked at her not with anger, but with disappointment. That look stayed with her now, as she sat at her kitchen table, staring at the untouched cup of tea before her. For years, she had prided herself on being fair, professional, efficient, but was that enough? Was it ever enough? Blank. Blank. Elijah's doubts deepened as the days passed. The airline's announcement of new diversity training had been met with a wave of public attention. But not all of it was positive. Online comments ranged from support to derision, the latter filled with the same quiet venom he had faced on that flight. "They're making a big deal out of nothing," one commenter wrote. "If the kid had just followed the rules, none of this would have happened." Elijah's heart sank as he read the words. The same story. Over and over, blame shifted onto the one who dared to speak up. The one who refused to be silent. It wasn't just Linda he was up against, it was a system that thrived on denial. On the pretense that the world was already fair. Grace noticed the change in him. The way he withdrew into himself. His usual energy replaced by a quiet resignation. One evening, as he sat at the piano, playing the same somber melody over and over, she sat beside him. "Elijah," she said gently, placing a hand on his shoulder. "What's going on?" He hesitated, his fingers stilling on the keys. I don't know if it matters. Any of it." Grace's heart ached at his words. "Of course it matters," she said. "You mattered to everyone who saw what happened. To that woman on the plane who spoke up for you. To the people who've reached out since then, saying they've faced the same thing. But it doesn't change anything," Elijah said, his voice breaking. "People like Linda will still look at me the same way. People like those commenters will still think I'm just making trouble." Grace was silent for a moment, her own anger and sadness threatening to overwhelm her. But she pushed it down, knowing her son needed her strength. "Change doesn't happen all at once," she said softly, "and it doesn't happen because it's easy. It happens because people like you refuse to give up." Blank. That night, Elijah found himself writing again. This time, it wasn't a letter to the airline or a speech for a meeting. It was a reflection, a way to make sense of everything he had felt. Everything he had seen. He wrote about the quiet moments of bias. The ones that didn't make headlines but shaped lives. He wrote about the exhaustion of always having to prove himself. The weight of carrying expectations and assumptions. And he wrote about the hope, the fleeting but powerful moments when someone spoke up. When someone saw him for who he truly was. By the time he finished, the first rays of dawn were breaking through his window. He set the pages aside, unsure if anyone would ever read them, but feeling lighter nonetheless. Blank. Linda, too, was writing. Her words came slower, more hesitant, but they carried the same weight. She wrote a letter not to Elijah, but to herself. "I thought I was just doing my job," she began, "but the truth is, I wasn't. I was protecting something I didn't even realize I was holding on to. A version of the world where people like me didn't have to question our place. Because it was always secure." She paused, the enormity of the admission pressing against her. But she kept going. "That young man didn't deserve what I did to him. And I'm not writing this to forgive myself. Or to make myself feel better. I'm writing it because I need to change. And change starts with seeing the truth." She folded the letter and placed it in a drawer, unsure if she would ever show it to anyone. But for the first time in days, she felt a flicker of clarity. The threads of their lives, Elijah's, Grace's, Linda's, continued to weave together, each of them navigating a world filled with quiet storms and unspoken battles. The weight of history loomed over them all, but so did the possibility of something new. For Elijah, the path forward was uncertain, but it was his to walk. And as he stepped into the day ahead, he carried with him the echoes of his mother's words, "You belong anywhere you choose to be." The letter Elijah wrote sat untouched on his desk for a day. Then too, its words stared back at him each time he passed. A quiet reminder of what he had yet to say. He wasn't sure who it was for himself, the airline, or the world, but it felt incomplete. Like the conversation that had started on that plane still lingered in the air. Unfinished. At his mother's urging, Elijah agreed to attend a community forum organized by a local advocacy group. Grace had been invited to speak about their experience. And though Elijah hesitated at first, her determination convinced him. People need to hear your voice, she said, not just the story, but you. The auditorium was modest but full. The crowd a tapestry of faces, young and old, of every background. As Elijah scanned the room, he saw both allies and skeptics, those who had come to listen and those who had come to challenge. The weight of expectation pressed against him, but he drew strength from Grace, who stood beside him, her posture as firm as her resolve. Blank. Blank. Meanwhile, Linda Holcomb sat in her car outside the airline's headquarters, debating whether to step inside. She had been invited to participate in a panel on equity and inclusion, a direct result of the complaint filed against her. It was optional, the invitation had said, but Linda knew what that really meant. She wasn't ready to face Elijah, not yet. But part of her knew she had to start somewhere. With a deep breath, she pushed open the door and walked into the building, her steps measured but heavy with uncertainty. Blank. The forum began with stories, voices rising one by one, recounting experiences that mirrored Elijah's. A woman in her 60s described being ignored at a high-end boutique. A young man spoke of being shadowed by security in a store. Each story was different, but the thread connecting them was the same: the quiet, persistent denial of belonging. When it was Elijah's turn to speak, the room fell silent. He stepped to the podium, his hands trembling slightly, but his voice steady. "I'm here because of what happened to me on a plane," he began, "but this isn't just about one flight. It's about all the ways we're told, over and over, that we don't belong. Sometimes it's a look, sometimes it's a word, sometimes it's a seat." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. What happened to me wasn't new. It wasn't unique, and that's the problem. As he spoke, he felt the room shift, not physically, but emotionally. The air grew heavier, the unspoken truths they all carried rising to the surface. For some, his words were validation. For others, they were a confrontation. And for a few, they were a revelation. Blank. Linda's panel was smaller, more formal, but no less tense. As she sat among her colleagues, she listened to stories from other employees, some sharing their experiences of bias, others reflecting on their own blind spots. When it was her turn to speak, she hesitated, the words catching in her throat. "I made a mistake," she began, her voice quieter than usual. "Not just on that flight, but in the assumptions I carried with me. I thought I was following the rules. But the truth is, I wasn't. I was protecting something I didn't even realize I believed in. The idea that some people belong in certain spaces, and others don't." Her colleagues shifted in their seats, some nodding in agreement, others avoiding her gaze. "It's not easy to admit," Linda continued, "but it's necessary, because if we don't confront these biases, we can't change." Back at the forum, the conversation turned to solutions. Elijah, emboldened by the support of the crowd, suggested a program to address bias at the community-level: workshops, open dialogues, spaces for people to confront and dismantle their assumptions. One man, seated near the back, raised his hand. His voice carried an edge of skepticism. "Do you really think talking about this will change anything? People are set in their ways." Elijah met his gaze, his own resolve hardening. "I think silence changes even less," he replied, "and I'd rather try than accept things as they are." The room erupted in applause, the sound reverberating like a wave of affirmation. For the first time in days, Elijah felt something shift inside him, a sense of agency, of possibility. Linda left the panel feeling drained but oddly lighter. She didn't have all the answers, but for the first time, she had begun to ask the right questions. As she walked to her car, she thought about Elijah, his calm defiance, his quiet strength. She didn't know if she would ever have the chance to make amends, but she promised herself she would try. The cracks in the foundation of their shared world were becoming visible now. For Elijah, Linda, and everyone else, the challenge wasn't just to see them but to decide what to do about them. The conversations they had started were only the beginning, but they carried the potential for something greater, a chance to rebuild, piece by piece, into something stronger. As the forum ended and the crowd began to disperse, Elijah stood with Grace, their hands clasped together. "You were right," he said quietly. "People needed to hear it." Grace smiled, her eyes shining with pride. "And they'll keep hearing it," she said, "because we're not done yet." The days after the forum brought a quiet clarity to Elijah. It was the kind of clarity that didn't come from answers but from understanding the depth of the questions. The noise of the world, the applause, the skepticism, the muted voices of support and dissent had quieted, leaving space for reflection. Yet, the road ahead was anything but still. In the weeks that followed, Elijah found himself increasingly drawn into conversations that felt heavier than the air they occupied. His story had gained attention in ways he hadn't anticipated. Local news outlets requested interviews. Advocacy groups reached out, and strangers sent him letters, some congratulatory, others dismissive, a few outright hostile. Blank. Blank. One letter stood out. The handwriting was neat, precise, and unfamiliar. Opening it, Elijah found himself reading words he hadn't expected. Dear Elijah, I don't know if you'll remember me, but I was the flight attendant on your flight. My name is Linda Holcomb. Elijah paused, his breath catching. His mother, seated across from him, looked up. What is it? She asked. Her voice edged with concern. It's from her, Elijah said quietly, handing Grace the letter. They read it together, Linda's words unfolding like a hesitant confession. I want to apologize for what I did. It wasn't right, and I knew that even as I acted, I made assumptions that I had no right to make. And I hurt you in ways I'm only beginning to understand. I've spent the last few weeks reflecting on my actions, attending the training the airline implemented, and trying to unlearn the biases I've carried for too long. I know an apology doesn't undo what happened, but I wanted you to know that your voice mattered. It changed me, and I hope it will continue to change others. If you're willing, I would like to meet and listen to your story, to whatever you're willing to share. But if not, I understand, and I will continue this work regardless. Elijah's hands trembled slightly as he folded the letter. He wasn't sure what he had expected from Linda, but it wasn't this. Grace watched him carefully, her expression unreadable. What are you going to do? She asked. Elijah didn't answer right away. Instead, he stared out the window, the weight of the decision pressing against him. Forgiveness was complicated. It wasn't a gift freely given, it was a reckoning, a negotiation with the pain that lingered. Blank. The meeting, when it finally happened, took place in a quiet corner of a local library. Linda arrived first, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her usually poised demeanor replaced by a tentative nervousness. Elijah entered a few minutes later, his mother by his side, her presence a silent pillar of support. Thank you for coming, Linda said, her voice softer than he remembered. She stood but didn't extend a hand, unsure of what felt appropriate. Elijah nodded, taking a seat across from her. I wasn't sure I would, he admitted. Linda's face tightened slightly, but she nodded. I wouldn't have blamed you if you hadn't. For a moment, the room was filled with a thick silence, each of them searching for the right words. It was Linda who spoke first. I've been a flight attendant for over 20 years. She began, and in that time, I've prided myself on being fair, professional. But what happened on that flight, it made me realize how much of that was an illusion. My actions weren't fair. They were rooted in assumptions I didn't even realize I held. Elijah listened, his face unreadable. Grace sat beside him, her eyes trained on Linda, her expression steady but watchful. I didn't ask you here to absolve me, Linda continued. I asked because I want to understand, to hear your experience, if you're willing to share it. Elijah leaned back slightly, his arms crossed. He hadn't expected this level of vulnerability from Linda, and it disarmed him in ways he hadn't prepared for. You made me feel small, he said finally, his voice measured but carrying the weight of the moment. Like I didn't belong. And it wasn't just about the seat, it was about everything that came with it. The looks, the whispers, the assumption that I couldn't possibly be where I was supposed to be. Linda's eyes glistened with unshed tears. But she didn't look away. I'm sorry, she said, her voice breaking. I truly am. Grace, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. Apologies are a start, she said, her tone firm but not unkind. But they don't mean much without action. What are you going to do differently, Linda? Linda straightened slightly, as though preparing for judgment. I've started working with the airline on their training programs, she said. I've shared my story, what I did, what I've learned, and I'm trying to have the hard conversations with myself, with my colleagues. It's not enough, I know, but it's a beginning. Elijah studied her, his expression softening ever so slightly. It is a beginning, he said quietly, but it's not the end. Blank. blank. As they left the library, Elijah felt a strange sense of release, not closure. Exactly, but something adjacent to it. The world hadn't changed overnight, but it had shifted, however slightly, and in that shift, there was room for hope. That night, as he sat at his desk, Elijah wrote another letter. This one wasn't for the airline, or for Linda, or even for himself. It was for the future, for the young boy he had seen on the plane. For the countless others who would face their own battles of belonging. We are not defined by the places they try to push us into. He wrote, we are defined by the way we push back, by the way we claim our space, even when the world tells us we don't deserve it. He paused, his pen hovering over the page, before adding one final line. And when we speak, even when our voices tremble, the world has no choice but to listen. With that, Elijah folded the letter and placed it in a drawer, knowing it was ready for whoever needed to read it next.